In my mind, it's always a good time to invest offshore. And that's not just because, I've got a biased perspective coming from Allen Gray and Orbis, but because, you want to think about how you structure your investment portfolio with a long-term perspective in mind. And to do that, you need to say to yourself, okay, well, why would I want to invest offshore, first of all? And then there are two main reasons why I think South Africans should invest offshore, and that's to diversify their portfolio and gain access to all these opportunities that are just simply not represented in our local markets. Dan was talking about it in his panel today. We've got 100, 200 stocks to choose from kind of in the South African context and thousands globally. There's no reason not to allow yourself the access to those types of opportunities. But also you want to protect your local purchasing power. In South Africa, at least a third of our annual inflation is essentially imported, which means that, let's say, for example, the cars we buy or the petrol or the goods that we consume in the shops, it's kind of denominated in currencies other than the rand. So if you want to protect your ability to continue to buy those goods into the future, you should sort of put at least as much of your portfolio offshore as you think you spend in offshore currencies on a day-to-day basis. But for me, that's a long-term decision. That's not a decision that changes kind of day-to-day or month-to-month. And so when you're figuring out how much of your portfolio should go offshore, you should make that decision kind of at the outset as part of your sort of long-term financial plan. And then you should just simply decide, how do I get there? What's the simplest, most efficient, kind of best way to sort of gain that exposure? And we would always recommend to clients not to try and time it, but simply to do it as part of a systematic, regular savings plan. If you can't put 20% or 30 or 40 or 50% of your portfolio offshore in one go, then just work towards achieving it in as regular a way as possible. And then what happens is you kind of average out the short-term volatility that we see in the currency and in the markets. And you've sort of got your mind focused on what's the much more important question, which is achieving your financial plan, rather than, sort of trying to time the exact entry point, which we know is basically impossible to do.
There are two variables to think about when you're trying to come up with that number. Firstly is to say, how much of the overall market does South Africa represent? And it's clear South Africa represents like less than 1%. So if everything else was equal and there were no restrictions at all, you would probably expect to have less than 1% of your portfolio in South Africa. The other thing factor that you need to consider is whether or not South African stocks are cheap or expensive relative to the rest of the world. And I think part of what was influencing Andrew's decision was that as he looks around, he doesn't find South African stocks particularly cheap relative to the rest of the world. As a result, his view was that the weighting should be as high as possible.
There is no necessarily right or wrong answer, and it also varies across individuals. It depends a lot on kind of what your sort of your daily or monthly requirements are in terms of how you need to draw your income. It depends on your overall risk profile and your tolerance, and it is a decision you should make if you have a financial advisor, then with your financial advisor and as part of a kind of long-term plan. But if you think about the regulations today, there's a sort of now within our regulation 28 or multi-asset class portfolios, we can have at least 30% offshore. So at a bare minimum, I would think people should have at least that amount, but then they should be looking to kind of add incremental amounts via direct offshore investments to increase that amount up to the level that they think is appropriate for them based on their own sort of specific circumstances. Well, one of my colleagues likes to call it the random, and I think it's a great description of it, because it is an incredibly volatile currency, and we watch it move up and down all the time, and people become fixated on it. And the problem with that is not that they shouldn't think about the rand, because it is an important consideration when you're thinking about investing offshore, but it is by no means the only consideration. And because we are so focused on the one thing that's moving around so much and is constantly reported on in the press, and we get daily updates, if not 2-hourly updates on where the rand is trading on any particular day, we spend less time thinking about why we're investing offshore, how much we want to put offshore, and most importantly, who and where we are putting it. So yes, you should think about the rand. You should think about trying not to be caught out at extremes, but the bulk of your attention and your focus and your deliberation should be focused on all the other factors.